She's a mother now. She second guesses everything. She's too emotional to fly. He said it with the door open. He said it in a room with a window onto the hangar floor where 9 people could hear him, and he did not lower his voice, because lowering his voice would have meant he thought he was doing something wrong. I was standing under that window with a flight bag on my shoulder and a helmet case in my hand. The man describing me had never once sat in the seat I sat in. He had never held a hover over a wash at night with the dust coming up white in the landing light. He had a title and a chair and a way of saying the word mother that made it sound like a diagnosis. I did not go up those stairs. I did not knock on that door. I walked out to the ramp, set my bag down, and stood in the heat until my hands were steady, because I had learned a long time ago that anger is just fuel that hasn't been metered yet. My name is Nadine Vollmer. I was 42 that summer. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment west of Phoenix with a window unit that rattled, a daughter who was 6, and a job flying air ambulances for a company I had trusted for 4 years and would never trust again. To understand how I ended up under that window in the middle of an Arizona August, I have to go back 11 weeks. Not to the flight, not to the courtroom, though we get there. I have to go back to a form, a single sheet of yellow paper, the kind that makes 3 copies when you press hard, sitting on a clipboard on a mechanic's bench at 4 in the afternoon with the metal too hot to touch. I had filled out that same form 3 times already that summer. That afternoon, I filled it out a 4th time. I wrote the same words in the same box in the same handwriting, and I signed it and I hung the clipboard back on its nail. And I remember thinking very clearly that somebody upstairs was going to get tired of seeing my name. I was right about that. I was wrong about which part of it would cost me. 12 years before any of this, I was a Navy helicopter pilot. Search and rescue. I will not dress that up for you because the people who actually do that work never do. It is long stretches of checklists and weather briefs and bad coffee at 2 in the morning, punctuated by 20 minutes where everything you have ever practiced happens at once. I flew an MH-60. I hoisted people off water, off rock, off the deck of a fishing boat that was rolling badly enough that my crew chief had to talk me down onto it a foot at a time. I did that until my knees and my marriage both wore out, and I came home and I put the flight suit in a closet. Then I did the thing a lot of us do. I found the nearest civilian version of the only work I knew. Air medical. Same weather, same night, different patch on the sleeve. Instead of a swimmer in the back, I had a flight nurse and a paramedic and a stretcher, and instead of a ship out past the horizon, I had a 2-lane highway with a pickup truck upside down on it. The company was called Saguaro Ridge Air Medical. Our base was a metal building and a fenced pad west of the city, out where the subdivisions give up and the creosote takes over. We called it Buckhorn. I loved it. I want to be honest about that because of what comes later. I loved that job. My daughter's name is June. Everybody calls her Junie. She was 6 that summer, missing 2 teeth on the bottom, and utterly convinced that her mother's helicopter was purple, which it was not. On my night shift, she slept at my sister Kirsten's house across town. I would call from the base before I strapped in, and Junie would tell me one fact she had learned that day. That was our thing. One fact. Her father and I had been divorced 2 years by then. Wade wasn't a villain. He was just a man who had gotten very good at describing my career as a hobby I refused to grow out of. Here is the part you need to understand about me, because everything that followed hung on it. I am not dramatic. I have never been dramatic. In 16 years of flying, I had never raised my voice on a radio, never filed a complaint about a coworker, never once let a shift end with something unsaid that should have been said. My whole trade is built on the opposite of drama. You take feelings and you set them on the shelf, and you handle facts in the order they arrive, and when the flight is over, you take the feelings back down and deal with them in your own kitchen with the lights off. Facts over feelings. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. That was my reputation for 16 years. Steady. Boring even. The kind of pilot the nurses requested when the weather looked ugly. And in one Friday morning, in one sentence, that reputation was rewritten into something else entirely by a man who had decided what I was before he ever met me. But before Friday, there was the chip light. Every helicopter has a gearbox that turns engine power into rotor power. And inside that gearbox is a plug with a magnet on the end of it. The magnet sits in the oil. If metal starts coming off the gears, the magnet catches it, and a light comes on in front of the pilot. That light is not an opinion. That light is the aircraft telling you that somewhere inside a box you cannot see, something hard is grinding against something else hard. Ship 624 gave me that light for the first time in the second week of June. I brought it back to Buckhorn, shut it down, and wrote it up on the yellow form. Maintenance pulled the plug, found what they described as fuzz, cleaned it, ran it, and signed it off. Fuzz is normal, metal is not. 19 days later, it happened again. I wrote it up again. The third time was on a Tuesday, with a patient in the back, and I made the hospital, and I did not enjoy the last 4 minutes of that flight one bit. Wrote it up again. The fourth time was that afternoon on the ramp with the clipboard, and by then I had stopped assuming it was fuzz. The mechanic who signed the first 3 of those forms was Tova Kirkendall, 44, chief mechanic at Buckhorn, built like someone who had been turning wrenches since she was 19, which she had. She kept a coffee tin under her bench. I had noticed it the way you notice anything you walk past twice a day, which is to say, not at all. The fourth time I handed her the form, she looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked out at the pad. "You're the only one writing these," she said. I told her that couldn't be right. There were 6 pilots on that airframe. 6 pilots, she said. 1 writer. I asked what she meant. She wiped her hands, and she took her time, and she said, "I mean people learn what happens to their hours when they ground an aircraft." That was the first time anybody said the quiet part to me out loud. And she didn't say it in a meeting or in an email. She said it in a hangar with a rag in her hand at a volume meant for exactly 1 person, because the company had a safety hotline. It was on a poster by the break room door, a phone number and a promise. Report anything. Anonymous, independent, no retaliation, ever. I called it 4 times. Once after every write-up. Each time a polite voice took my information and told me the matter would be reviewed. Each time nothing came back. Not a letter, not a call, not one follow-up question about an aircraft that had told me 4 separate times that it had metal in its gearbox. I assumed the system was slow. That is the thing about people like me. We assume the system is slow. 11 weeks, 4 forms, 4 phone calls, 1 aircraft. And then, the last Thursday in July dispatch called me at 9 at night on the worst weather evening of that entire summer. Here is what a monsoon night looks like in that valley, in case you have never stood in one. The heat breaks around 6. The sky over the mountains turns the color of an old bruise. Somewhere out past Gila Bend, the outflow picks up the desert floor and stands it on end, and a wall of dust 2,000 feet tall starts walking north across the flats. From a distance, it does not look like weather. It looks like the ground has decided to get up. At 9 that night, I was in the crew room with my boots off when the tones went. Rollover on the interstate. Single vehicle. A 16-year-old boy in the passenger seat, pinned with ground crews already working him out. The nearest trauma center that could take him was St. Ambrose, 40 air miles behind me and a great deal farther by road. My crew that night was Camille Ordonez on the nursing side and Ruben Tully on the medic side. Camille had been flying longer than I had. Ruben was newer, quick, still young enough to want every call. I pulled the weather. The wall was moving, and the timing was ugly but workable. Legal is not the same thing as wise, but that night the numbers were both. We launched at 9:19. I remember Reuben saying something about the lightning to the south that made Camille laugh through her nose. I remember the valley lights sliding underneath and then thinning and then giving out entirely the way they do when you leave the last subdivision behind. 11 minutes into that flight, the chip light came on. Not a flicker. Steady amber in the middle of the panel, right where a designer put it a long time ago, so that a tired human being at night would not be able to look at anything else. I called it out. Camille went quiet in the back, which is what good flight nurses do. Reuben asked once whether it was serious. I told him what it was, and I did not decorate it. Let me tell you exactly what a pilot does in the seconds after that light comes on, because a room full of people who have never done it later describe those seconds as an emotional episode. You check the gauges that would tell you if it is already failing. Temperature, pressure, vibration in the pedals, in the seat, in the stick. You listen. Then you ask yourself the only question that matters. If this box quits, where do I want to be standing? That night, the honest answer was that I did not want to be standing anywhere along the next 30 miles of my route, because those 30 miles were open desert with a dust wall crossing them in the dark, no lights, no roads worth the name, and no second chance if I had to put it down fast. Ahead of me, the weather was closing the door. Behind me, the valley was still open. Below me, sitting off the left side about 4 miles back, was the old crop strip at Redbird Wash. Dirt, unlit, but long and flat, and I had overflown it 100 times. I turned. I told dispatch we were aborting, gave them the reason in 9 words, and asked them to launch ground transport to the scene immediately. Then I flew the aircraft the way you fly one that may be about to become a glider, which is gently and low and without a single unnecessary input. We were on the ground at Redbird Wash at 9:34. I shut it down. The rotor spun itself out. And out there in the dark, with the dust starting to reach us, the 3 of us sat in a helicopter in the middle of nowhere and listened to the county radio work a call we could not fly. Reuben asked me if we had just made a mistake. I told him the truth, which was that I did not know yet. That is the answer nobody wants, and the only honest one available. The boy went by ground ambulance. He arrived at St. Ambrose 26 minutes later than he would have arrived with us. He lived. Full recovery. He graduated 2 years later, and I have a photograph of it that I did not ask for and will never throw away. I drove home at dawn through a valley scrubbed clean by the storm, and I stood in my kitchen, drinking water out of the tap, and I felt the thing you feel after a night like that. Not fear, not pride, just the flat, tired certainty that you made the call you were paid to make. I slept 4 hours. My phone rang at 9. It was the chief pilot, Marcus Pell, and he wanted me at the office by noon, and his voice had a careful quality to it that I had never heard from him before. The drive out to Buckhorn takes 35 minutes. I have replayed those 35 minutes more times than I can tell you, because I spent every one of them assuming I was going in to talk about a gearbox. I walked in at 11:50. Marcus was in the small conference room, so was Bettina Ross from Human Resources, and so was the operations director, a man named Del Hargrove. Hargrove had come to Saguaro Ridge a year before that, from a company that hauled freight. He wore good shoes he called every aircraft an asset and every crew a resource, and at the all-hands meetings he liked to say that our biggest competitor was hesitation. He did not ask me about the chip light. His first question was about the 26 minutes. "Do you understand," he said, "that a child sat on the pavement for 26 extra minutes because you turned around?" I told him that a chip light on a main gearbox is a mandatory consideration, that the weather was deteriorating, and that the two together made continuing unjustifiable. "That's a lot of words," he said, "for a decision you made in your gut." I said it was a decision I made, with an amber light in front of me and a dust wall in the windscreen. Marcus looked at the table the entire time. And I want to be fair to him, because I do not think Marcus was a cruel man. I think Marcus was a man who had a mortgage. Then Hargrove said the thing that ended the meeting. Nadine, nobody's questioning your history. But things change for people. You've got a little girl now. That changes what a person can carry. I asked him what he meant by that. He smiled, and he said, I think you know. They put me on paid administrative leave, pending a review of the flight. I signed the acknowledgement. I picked up my bag and my helmet case, and I walked out through the hangar toward the parking lot. And that is when I passed under the window of that office, where the door was open, and where a man who had never flown a night mission in his life was explaining to two other people that she's a mother now, she second guesses everything, she's too emotional to fly. I did not go back inside. I got in my truck, but I did sit there for a moment, with my hands on the wheel. And I thought about the fact that a review is supposed to look at what happened. Nobody in that room had asked me what happened. They had already decided, and now they were building the paperwork backward from the decision, and I would not understand how literally true that was for another 5 weeks. Paid administrative leave is a strange kind of punishment, because on paper it looks like a vacation. The review was supposed to take 10 business days. On day 11, my status changed from leave to available, which should have been good news. But when the next schedule posted, my name was on it for 4 hours. 4 hours. In a month. I called scheduling. Scheduling said staffing decisions came from operations now. I called operations. Operations did not call back. The month after that, I had 0 hours, and my medical benefits were tied to a minimum I was suddenly not going to reach. Nobody had fired me. That was the elegance of it. No letter to point at, nothing an attorney could hold up in the air and say, look at this. Just a woman who used to fly 11 shifts a month and now flew none. Therefore, I asked for my personnel file. I had a right to it under state law. I sent the request in writing, and I was polite in it, because I am always polite in writing. 8 days later, a thin envelope came to my apartment, and I opened it standing up at the kitchen counter. There were 3 entries in that file I had never seen, and had never been told about. The first said that, on a night in June, I had been counseled for reporting to shift late. I checked my own logbook, my base badge history, and the timestamp on a fuel receipt. I had walked in 22 minutes ahead of report time that night. The second said that in early July I had declined a flight for reasons described as personal discomfort with conditions. I had never declined a flight at that company, not once. The weather log for that night showed clear skies and 8 miles of visibility. The third was about the abort at Redbird Wash, and it used the phrase emotional decision-making, and it was signed by Del Hargrove. I stood there for a long time with those 3 sheets of paper in my hand. Let me ask you something. What do you do when the official story about your life is being written by someone who was not there because your first instinct is to explain? Mine was. I sat down and I started drafting a response, 4 pages of it calm and numbered and airtight. Then I stopped and I put the pen down and I understood something that took the air out of the room. They were not confused. You cannot correct a person who is not confused. That was the Tuesday. The Thursday, an envelope came from Wade's attorney, a request to modify the custody arrangement. It cited in careful lawyer sentences a material change in circumstances, loss of stable income, concerns regarding professional judgment as documented by the mother's employer. As documented by the mother's employer. I sat with that line at my kitchen table with my daughter's cereal bowl still in the sink, and for the first and only time in this entire story, my hands shook. They had turned a gearbox into a question about whether I was fit to raise my own child. 2 days later, Human Resources called and asked me to come in Friday morning. Bettina was pleasant about it. She said it would be a short conversation. She said, and I remember this precisely, that I did not need to bring anything with me. I brought everything. The conference room at Buckhorn has a window air handler that clicks. I sat with a folder in front of me that nobody asked to open. Bettina Ross sat across from me, and Del Hargrove sat at the end, where he could see the door. Bettina did the talking. She said the company had concluded that the working relationship was no longer viable and that they were prepared to be generous. She slid a document across the table. $31,000. 6 months of health coverage, a neutral reference meaning that if anyone called about me, the company would confirm my dates of employment and nothing else. I turned to the second page because the second page is where the actual price is always printed. The agreement required me to release all claims and keep the terms confidential. And it required me to agree that I would not make any statement to any party regarding the maintenance status, safety practices, or operational decisions of the company or its aircraft. Any party. I sat with that sentence for a while. The air handler clicked. Then I asked one question, and I asked it without any heat at all, because heat would have given them something to write down. I asked whether the write-ups I had signed on Ship 624 had ever been forwarded to anybody outside the base. Bettina looked at Hargrove. Hargrove said, "That's not what this meeting is about." I said I understood. I picked up the pen they had set out for me. Bettina had her hands folded. Hargrove had leaned back a quarter inch, the way a man does when the hard part is over. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I put the cap back on the pen and set it down on top of the paperwork, squared up the way you leave a tool where the next person can find it. I said, "No, thank you." Hargrove said I should think about my situation. I told him I had been thinking about very little else, and that this was the result of the thinking. Then I stood up and I walked out through that hangar for the last time as an employee of Saguaro Ridge Air Medical. Past the pad, past the fuel farm, out into a parking lot where the asphalt was soft in the heat. And leaning against the tailgate of my truck, with her arms folded and her sunglasses pushed up on her head, was Tova Kirkendall. She had a coffee tin under her arm. Tova did not do small talk. She said, "How long did they give you to sign?" I told her I had already answered them. "Good," she said. "Then I don't have to talk you out of it." She nodded me over toward the fence, and we stood in the only piece of shade in that entire lot. Two women in our 40s who had spent our whole lives around loud machines and were both slightly deaf on the left side because of it. She held out the tin, an old coffee can, the big kind, labels sanded off, a strip of tape on the lid. It was heavier than it looked. I asked her what it was. "Carbons," she said. "Every write-up that's come across my bench since I got here. I keep the yellow copy. The white one goes upstairs, the pink one goes in the aircraft binder, and the yellow one goes in the can." I asked her why, and she gave me a look that I have thought about 100 times since. Not a dramatic look, a tired one. She said, "Because binders go missing, Nadine. Cans don't." She had been doing it for 6 years at every base she had worked, ever since she watched a maintenance binder become extremely difficult to locate at extremely convenient timing. I asked her whether she could get in trouble for handing me that can. Tova said, "Probably." I asked her why she was doing it anyway. She looked out at the pad where Ship 624 was sitting in the sun, with the blades tied down. And she said something. I'm going to say exactly the way she said it, because I've got a kid too. And because whoever flies that ship next doesn't know what you know. Then she said one more thing before she got in her truck. She said, "There's a page in the bottom of that can you're going to want to sit down for. It's not a carbon, it's a printout. Somebody left it on the copier in April, and I don't think they meant to." I did not open the can in that parking lot. I drove it home, and I set it on my kitchen table, and I waited until my daughter was asleep at my sister's, and the apartment was so quiet I could hear the ice maker. It was 10 minutes past 1 in the morning when I took the lid off. Yellow carbons go soft with age. They smell faintly of solvent and cardboard. There were hundreds of them in that can, folded twice, packed in tight, and I sat on my kitchen floor and sorted them by tail number until almost 2. Ship 624 had a stack of its own. 4 of those forms were in my handwriting. But underneath my 4 were 11 more that were not mine. 11 write-ups on that same gearbox going back 19 months in 6 different hands. Pilots who had gone to other companies, one who had gone back to school. Every one of them describing the same amber light on the same aircraft. I was not the only one who had written them. I was only the one still there. I laid them out in date order, and the pattern came up out of that table like a photograph coming up in a tray. Then I went to the bottom of the can and found the printout. 4 pages printed small. The internal activity log for the company's safety hotline. Every call. Date opened category base assigned reviewer. Date shut, disposition. I found my 4 calls. All 4 were opened and shut on the same day. Not the same week, the same day. Disposition on every one of them was the same 3 words. No action required. And in the column marked assigned reviewer, on all 4 were 2 initials. D.H., the hotline that promised me independence, the one on the poster that said your report goes outside your chain, had been routing my reports to the operations director. To the one man on that base with a direct financial interest in that aircraft staying in the air. I sat back on my heels on my own kitchen floor. But the thing that actually took my breath was not on the hotline log at all. It was in my personnel file, the thin envelope which was still sitting on the counter where I had left it, the entry about my emotional decision-making at Redbird Wash, the one Hargrove signed. I checked the date on it. It was dated 3 days before the flight. Say that back to yourself slowly, the way I did, at 2 in the morning, with the ice maker running. The document describing my judgment during a flight had been created 72 hours before that flight ever happened. Somebody had built a file on me and then gone looking for a night to hang it on. Sometimes you find the truth and it makes you angry. Sometimes you find it and it makes you very, very calm. I made coffee, I got a legal pad, and at 10 minutes past 3 in the morning, I looked up the number for an attorney my old squadron mate had used, and I left a voicemail that I have since heard again out loud in a courtroom. I said, "My name is Nadine Vollmer. I think my former employer falsified a safety file. I have the paperwork. I would like to know what I am legally required to do about it." Delia Ocampo called me back at 7:15 that same morning. She had spent 11 years as a judge advocate general attorney before private practice, which meant she was not intimidated by aviation and had spent a decade watching institutions produce documents. She came to my apartment. She spread the carbons across my table. She spent 40 minutes saying nothing at all except occasionally. Then she said, "You understand that this is not a hurt feelings case." I said I did not want a hurt feelings case. "Good," she said, "because you don't have one. You have a retaliation case, and you have a public safety problem, and those 2 things are going to travel together whether anybody likes it or not." She filed wrongful termination and retaliation for protected safety reporting. Then the company did the thing that told me everything about what they knew. They fought the flight data. Every modern air ambulance has a box on it that logs what the aircraft did. Not sound, not video. Parameters. Time, altitude, torque, temperature warnings, and the exact second any caution light illuminates. It is not a matter of interpretation. It is a machine writing down what another machine did. We asked for the download from the night of the abort. Their counsel, a smooth man named Bram Sedgwick, argued that it was proprietary, irrelevant to a personnel matter, and unduly burdensome to produce. Unduly burdensome. For a file. Judge Renata Whitlock listened to that for about 90 seconds before she ordered it produced. And while we waited, in the last week of September, my phone rang with a number from the base. It was Tova. She said, "Sit down." 6 weeks after they walked me out of that hangar ship, 624 had launched on a transfer and made a precautionary landing at an airport in Buckeye with an illuminated chip light. Maintenance pulled the plug that time, under supervision, and it did not come out with fuzz on it. It came out with metal. Visible, curled, unmistakable metal. The gearbox came off the aircraft. It never went back on. The pilot who made that landing was 27, 4 months out of training, a young man named Trey Alderson. He did exactly what I had done. He turned around, he put it on the ground, and he shut it off. The company issued a statement praising his sound judgment. Nobody asked whether he had children. The trial began on a Monday in February in a county civil courtroom with bad carpet and a clock that you could hear from the back row. I wore a gray suit. I did not wear anything from my service. No pin, no ring, nothing. Delia had been firm about that, and she had been firm about something else, too. She said, "You will not tell that jury what you are. You will tell them what happened. Somebody else will tell them what you are, and it will land 10 times harder." So I testified for 2 hours, and I did not say the word commander once. I said what the light did. I said what the weather did. I said what I did. When Sedgwick asked me whether I had felt frightened that night, I told him I had felt occupied. He asked whether motherhood had changed my flying. I said that motherhood had changed my sleep. Then, on the second morning, they called a man named Emery Castellan. He was a federal aviation accident investigator, 26 years in the job, with the manner of somebody who long ago stopped being impressed by anybody in a room. He wore a brown jacket. He set a binder on the rail in front of him and opened it flat. Delia asked him to describe for the jury what the flight data download from the night of July 29th showed, and he went down it line by line in a completely level voice. He said the aircraft lifted at 9:19 and 38 seconds. He said the climb was normal, the torque was normal, the temperatures were normal. He said that, at 10 minutes and 51 seconds into the flight, the master caution and the main gearbox chip annunciator both illuminated, and that they stayed illuminated for the remainder of the flight. He said that for the next 19 seconds, the aircraft continued straight and level with no control input of any significance. He paused there, and Delia asked him what those 19 seconds indicated to him. Castellan said, "It indicates the pilot was checking her instruments before she touched anything. It is what you would want." He said that at 11 minutes and 10 seconds, the aircraft began a shallow turn to the left, that the rate of turn never exceeded standard, that the descent was gradual and stable, and that the aircraft touched down at 9:34 and 19 seconds at an unimproved field. He said the vertical speed at touchdown was so low, he had gone back and checked the sensor. Then, Delia asked him the question she had built the entire morning around. She asked whether, in his professional judgment, anything in that data was consistent with panic hesitation or emotional decision-making. Castellan looked at the jury for the first time. He said, "No, that is not what panic looks like in data. Panic is late, and it is jerky. This is early, and it is smooth. This is a trained pilot running a procedure." Sedgwick objected. The judge allowed it. Then Delia asked him to tell the jury the professional history of the pilot who flew that profile, because she had subpoenaed the file to do it, and Castellan turned a page and simply recited it. 12 years of naval service. Rescue helicopters. Lieutenant commander at retirement. More than 4,000 rotorcraft hours, over 1,100 of them at night, several hundred in what he called degraded visual environments. 4 years of civilian air medical flying with no accidents, no incidents, and no violations. I sat there with my hands folded and I looked at the table because it is a very strange thing to hear your own life spoken aloud by a stranger in a room full of people who came in thinking you were a woman who got scared. And that was when I understood what Delia had done. If I had said one word of that about myself, I would have been a woman defending herself. Said by him, it was simply the file. Then he moved to the write-ups. He put the 11 prior forms and my 4 into the timeline, one at a time, 19 months of them. And the jury watched the same amber light come on over and over on the same aircraft in 6 different handwritings. Each time the gearbox was cleaned and returned to service. No component was ever replaced. Then he described what maintenance found in October in Buckeye on that same gearbox. He used one sentence for it. He said, "There was metal on the plug, and there had been metal in that gearbox, in my opinion, for a considerable time." Nobody moved. The clock kept going. Del Hargrove took the stand that afternoon. He was good for about 11 minutes. Mission completion rates, industry standards, difficult decisions in a demanding business. Then Delia asked him whether the safety hotline was independent of base management. He said it was. He said that was the entire point of it. She asked whether he had ever personally reviewed a hotline report from his own base. He said he did not believe so. She put the printout in front of him. 4 pages. She asked him to identify the 2 initials in the reviewer column of 4 particular entries, all 4 opened and shut on the same day, all 4 dispositioned, no action required. The courtroom was extremely quiet. He said, "Those are my initials." Then, Delia handed him the personnel entry about my emotional decision-making, and she asked him to state the date on the document, and then she asked him to state the date of the flight it described. He looked at the paper for a long time. Judge Whitlock let the silence sit. She did not fill it, she did not hurry him, and I have thought since that she knew exactly what she was doing, because there is nothing in the world louder than a courtroom waiting for a man to answer a question about a calendar. Finally, he said the 2 dates. And then the judge, who had said almost nothing for 2 days, leaned forward slightly and asked him one question of her own. She asked, "Mr. Hargrove, how does a document describe a flight that has not happened yet?" He said he would have to check with his office. The jury was out for 4 hours. They came back for me on both counts. The award was $2,600,000, most of it punitive, which is the law's way of saying the jury was not primarily interested in making me whole, they were interested in making a point. I did not celebrate. I sat in that chair and felt something let go in my chest that had been holding on since a hot afternoon in July, and my eyes stung, and that was the entire extent of it. Delia squeezed my arm once and said, "Facts over feelings." The next part is the part I am proudest of, and it is not the verdict. 8 days later, the company came to us with an offer. They would not appeal. They would pay promptly. They would add to the number. In exchange, the judgment and the underlying findings would be sealed. The write-up history, the hotline log, the data download, all of it out of reach of any other pilot, any other family, any other attorney, permanently. More money. Quieter. Faster. Done before spring. Delia laid it out, and then sat back and let me think, because a good lawyer does not tell you what your own life is worth. I thought about the 11 pilots whose handwriting I had sorted on my kitchen floor. I thought about a 27-year-old kid putting that same ship down at Buckeye with the same light in his face. I thought about what would have happened if just one of those 11 forms had ever left that base. And I thought about a coffee can, and a woman with a rag in her hand saying, "Binders go missing, cans don't." I told Delia no. I want to be careful here, because this is where a story like mine can turn ugly, and I have no interest in that. I did not want Del Hargrove ruined. I never asked for it, and I never celebrated it. But the findings stayed open, and open findings travel. The company lost 2 hospital contracts inside a year. It was folded into its parent, and the Buckhorn base shut down. Hargrove was gone before the summer, and I hope he is fine, and I hope he never again gets to write a sentence about a person he has not spoken to. None of that was my doing. That was the truth arriving on its own schedule. All I did was decline to help hide it. On the courthouse steps that afternoon, in that flat February sunlight, Tova Kirkendall lit a cigarette she had been saving and squinted out at the parking lot. She said, You know what I keep thinking about? I asked her what. She said, nobody ever wrote up that gearbox after you left. Not once. 6 weeks and the only paper on that ship is yours and that kid's. She took a drag. They didn't have a pilot problem, she said. They had a paper problem. You were just the only one still handing them paper. That was 3 years ago. I fly again. Not air medical. I fly power line patrol for a small outfit north of the valley, out over country where the only thing under you for an hour at a time is rock and juniper and wire. The pay is worse and the hours are better, and nobody has ever once used the word asset in my hearing. Junie is 9 now. She lost the purple helicopter theory around her 7th birthday and replaced it with an interest in horses that costs me considerably more. There is a hallway in our house, and about halfway down it, in a plain black frame, there is a crayon drawing of a helicopter with a stick figure in the front seat and a very large sun in the corner. She drew it when she was 6. It stayed on the refrigerator the whole summer everything happened, and all the way through the trial, held up by a magnet shaped like a chili pepper. I framed it because it was the only thing in that apartment during those months that told me the truth about myself without being asked to. The flight suit is in a box on the shelf in the garage now, with the patches still on it. I take it out about once a year, not to wear it, just to check that I still recognize the person it belonged to. I do. Here is what I actually want to leave you with, and it has almost nothing to do with helicopters. They did not lie about me because they believed the lie. They lied because it was cheaper than fixing a gearbox. That is usually what is underneath it. When someone rewrites who you are, look at what it saves them. And I did not get through it by being brave. I got through it because I kept handing in the paper. 4 times on a form nobody upstairs wanted, in my own handwriting with my own name at the bottom. Do the small correct thing on the day it is inconvenient. Write it down, sign it. It will feel like nothing at the time. Years later, in a room you have not imagined yet, a stranger in a brown jacket may open a binder and speak the plain facts of what you did, and every person there will hear who you actually were the entire time. You do not have to argue with people about your character. You only have to leave a trail that argues for you. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who is being quietly written out of a place they earned. And if you would like to sit with me for another one of these, I would be glad to have you back. The end.